Here we go.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Fred Murphy. I work with the Marxist Education Project, and we're very glad to have back to our event space today Mitch Abidor, a good friend of the MEP for many years. Mitch, of course, is the author of the new book, Victor Serge, Unruly Revolutionary. He's a writer and translator. He's translated many works. He's the author of May Made Me, and I'll Forget It When I Die, the Bisbee Deportation of 1917. He's translated and edited a number of Victor Serges' works, including Serges' notebooks, edited and translated with Richard Grieman. Mitch is going to be in conversation today with Jacob Plitman, who's the former publisher of Jewish Currents. And I am going to turn it over now to Mitch and Jacob. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, so hi everybody. Again, my name is Jacob. I'm the former publisher of Jewish Currents. And just quickly, because we are all on a Zoom, it might be important for us to make sure our microphones are muted. And we're going to talk a little bit about the book, and then we're going to jump into questions and answers. You can put questions here in the chat. And I'm sending you a notification now. So if you click what just turned red on your screen, you should be able to put questions. And you can put questions at any time, and we'll get to them towards the end of the talk. So yes, very happy to be here. I'll take any opportunity to chop it up with Mitch. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Some of the first things I want to ask about is just some general information about the book and some of your motivations for writing it. And I just want to say I really enjoyed this book. What I've known of Serge, I knew mostly from his novels. I had a sort of Wikipedia understanding of the course of his life, and it's a really fascinating and even cinematic book. And so the first thing I want to say is I really enjoyed the opportunity to get to read this, and I'm excited to talk about it with you. And I think the first thing, really, I want to ask the question sort of why you wrote it, and maybe we can talk about the cover also, which I think I'll put up on my screen, and I think contains some of what is important about this book and its offering about Serge himself.
Okay, sure. So like almost everything else in English on Victor Serge, this all goes back to Richard Grieman. So Richard is the one who I'm sure everybody here knows. He's the one who basically brought Serge into English. He's translated most of his novels. He's corrected former translations. He added missing stuff to the Memoirs of a Revolutionary from the original edition that was available in English. And when I first started translating Serge, and it was mainly his anarchist period, which was totally ignored. So I started translating them and putting them up on the Marxist Internet Archive. And Richard saw them there, and as the Serge, the main Serge propagator, he got in touch with me, and we became friends. He helped me get that book published, and he had started writing a biography of Serge in 1968, and had assembled amazing stuff, and had never been able to finish it. So because he saw that I was somebody who worked fast, quickly, knew and clearly appreciated Serge, he asked me if I would take over the book. And so I did. I started working on the book with Serge, but it turned out to be really much more difficult. Richard is now full-time in Montpellier. He used to be part of the year in New York, most of the year in Montpellier, France. It turned out to be really a tough process for us to work collaboratively on this book. And we tried twice, and it just didn't work. There were also differences of interpretation, and so we had to abandon it. And a few years ago, I was in London talking about my book on May 68, and I met for lunch with the editor at Pluto, and I told him I wanted to do a book on Serge just in Mexico, because after having translated the memoirs, I was really fascinated by Serge's ideas and how they evolved while he was in Mexico. But the editor said, listen, why don't you just take over the whole book and do it? So Richard, we knew we couldn't work together, but Richard, at this point, his health was failing. He said, Mitch, just do it. it's your book, do it. You could use all my material. If you want to use the stuff that we wrote together. In the end, I didn't. Uh, and so that's how the book came about. So everything in it, I owe to Richard, except the interpretations. And so there's the story behind the book. But you know, what's always the case with a biography is the biography ends up being, having a lot to do with the biographer as much as the biography. And so this is where the difference in interpretations came, and I'm sure that's going to be the point of our discussion here, because the way I saw Serge at the end of the book of writing it was not the way I saw him when I came in, and which leads to the cover of the book, which you can all see there, and some of you might recognize it that it was the cover also of the New York Review edition of Tulayev, Comrade Tulayev. But here it's a little bit clearer, and the story of this picture is if you when you I'm hoping all of you will read the book. We credit Susie Weissman, who wrote the only previous full-length biography of Serge in English. And so I asked Edwin Frank, who's the head of New York Review Books, where he got the picture from, and he couldn't remember. And then he remembered that he took a picture of it in Susie Weissman's book. So I got in touch with Susie, and she said, I don't know where the picture is. I remember that Vladdy, Serge's son, gave it to him, but she had no recollection of where it came from. But what's fascinating about the picture is, and you can see it very clearly here, this is not accidental. He's crossed out. And what's so who did it? Now, Susie had no idea. She couldn't remember what the story was behind the picture. But in fact, this picture is the absolute perfect representation of the book. Number one, because the book ended up seeking, or I think in demythologizing Serge, because everybody loves Victor Serge, but people don't really know who Victor Serge was. And this picture, so him being crossed out is kind of representing that. But also when I try to figure out who could have done this, and in fact, anybody in his family had reason to do this, to deface the picture. There was first his son Vladdy, who he worshipped and who traveled with him, who, when he was sent to the isolator, Vladdy, as a child, accompanied him. He was accompanied him on all of his travels, on everything. But at the end of their lives, Vladdy and Serge did not agree on politics at all, and so their relationship was strained. So it could have been Vladdy. And then there's Janine, his daughter, who was completely ignored throughout her life. She was an afterthought. Serge didn't want her. And in his writing, she seldom appears. In his letters, she appears even less. So could have been Janine. Then, of course, there's his final wife, Laurette Séjourné. Their marriage was a miserable marriage. He cheated on her, she cheated on him. Uh, they were unhappy. They never should have wed. I cover the marriage as well as you can through the available documentation, and found some really fascinating stuff that hadn't been published before, including a diary of their affair when they first met, written in Russian to hide from prying eyes when they were living in Paris. So it could have been Laurette, who also never refused to go back to France at the end of the war. And so Serge couldn't go back to France. And then, of course, there's Serge himself. In this, it's no reason to exclude his own disgust with the way everything had turned out for him to cross out. So the book really, I think, it's kind of a summary. The photo, rather, is a perfect summary of the book.
Mitch, you mentioned that the Serge that you knew when you started writing the book was really different than the Serge that you knew at the end of the process. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the sort of image that you had and then versus the person that sort of emerged through your research.
But the image that I had was I would guess it's the same image that everybody else had. Maybe, yeah. So I made the mistake that none of us should make, which is you take the memoirist at his word. It's a very bad idea. It's a very, very, very bad idea. I've read very few memoirs where the person really told the unvarnished truth about themselves. And Serge doesn't tell the truth. And I discovered it, I've read the memoirs several times. And this is what, with the Serge I was going to write about. But I knew that what he says about his anarchist period was not true even before I started writing the biography. That I knew how deeply involved he was in elements of anarchism that he denied having anything to do with, most particularly illegalism. He wasn't part of the Bonneau gang, but he absolutely, no matter what he says, absolutely wrote many times in support of theft as a revolutionary act, and even the killing of police. And of course, he denied all that. So when I sat down to write it, I had that kind of like floating in my head. But when, and then of course, there's to go like later in his life, I had the notion that, he went, as he says about himself, he makes all the different ideas, ideologies that he followed over the course of his life. He makes it seem like it was a clean split from one to the other. He's a socialist, then he's an anarchist, and then he's a revolutionary syndicalist, and then he's a Bolshevik when the revolution takes place. And then, when the revolution goes after Lenin's death, he becomes a supporter of Trotsky. And then when he sees that Trotsky is basically a sectarian, doctrinaire, mean human being, he moves on from that to a different form of opposition, revolutionary socialism, and never betrays the socialist ideal. He never turns into an anti-communist. And I found that absolutely, reading the source documents, nothing of that was true. So it really was a case where working on the biography at almost every stage dented his reputation and what I thought about him. The first period, because I was working with Richard, so I think it was the first, no, the first period I worked on, right, was his individualist anarchist years, which I knew he was fudging the truth in his memoirs, where he says he never advocated this stuff, the illegalism, because I knew he had, because I translated the stuff myself, so I knew it. And I had the articles. I have every article he ever wrote as an anarchist. And if I had $1 for every time he wrote in praise of crime, I'd have a lot of dollars. So then I read about the trial of the Bonneau gang. Now, the Bonneau gang, for those who don't know, they were the French, they called the tragic bandits. So they were anarchists who engaged in a murderous crime spree. And they became kind of folk heroes, and in a way, sometimes still are viewed that way. And most of them, in fact, all of them, were real anarchists, real individualist anarchists. It's a school I love. It's a school I've done 2 books about. And they were friends of Serge's. Half of them were people Serge had known when he was when he was in Brussels, where he was born. But so I knew that he was more deeply involved. I also knew, because I read it, his final speech before he was arrested in 1912 was in praise of illegalism, because the police transcribed it at the place that he gave it. So I knew, I was smelling a rat as I was getting into this. And then I read the accounts of the trial. And at the trial, Serge did something that was totally unacceptable for any revolutionary. he there was another anarchist at the time, a guy named Andre Laroulo, who he suspected was a police agent, and who also had the same ideas as Serge. And while he was on the stand, Serge says, he said the same stuff as me. Why isn't he arrested? Or why isn't he in jail? Why isn't he on trial? And even if you don't like somebody, that seems like an excessive thing to do. So I began to develop my doubts about the man. Then I read, so he went to, after he spent 5 years in prison, the story was he, it was there that he like rejected individualist anarchism. This is what he wrote, that he realized it was a dead end, and he goes to Barcelona because he's expelled from France. And there he meets syndicalists and he discovers the joys of mass revolutionary action. And to an extent, that's true. And that's what his novel Birth of Our Power is about. And he writes about it in his memoirs. Except he, while he was there, he was writing letters to former comrades in the individualist movements saying, I'm still one of you. And they were sending him money. And he continued to write for the individualist press. So now the rat is getting a little bit bigger. I exaggerate calling him a rat, but only slightly. So, and so I'm discovering all this because I'm not reading his memoirs. You know, I'm reading anarchist newspapers from the period, and in Spain and in France. So now the Barcelona story is not so clear. He started using the name Victor Serge when he was in Barcelona. And I read the first articles that he wrote after the Russian Revolution, which he says he completely convinced them that he's ready, he had to go. Except his first article, which is called Azar, which is titled Azar Falls, he expresses his doubts about the Russian Revolution, that it'll accomplish anything. So he didn't like immediately become a Bolshevik. Although he did, he maneuvers, he finds a way to get to Russia, where he writes all these really important articles. You can find them all on Marxist.org or in my book. I prefer you buy my book, where he talks about how the Russian Revolution is fulfilling the Bolshevik Revolution is fulfilling the anarchist dream. And he's writing these glowing articles about the Bolshevik Revolution. So, okay, there we go. And this is where I have to say that Richard and I had a falling out. Richard had assembled some documentation. I found others. So I read anarchist newspapers from Spain, from Italy, from France, in which anarchists from all over the world report going to Moscow to visit Serge, when he's writing how this is the Bolshevik Revolution is for every anarchist and they should all move there and help make the revolution. He's telling people, this place is like totally fucked up. But please don't tell anybody I said so. So, and he describes the place as a horror when he's talking to anarchists, but he's writing that it's a paradise. And there's a long section in my book where I cover this. So, I mean, I could go on, Jacob, but I want to let you, but and this carries through the entire book, I think. Right,
Well, I
right,
think
Jacob?
you're getting, I mean, you're getting right at what I want to ask about. Because I mean, part of reading the book, I mean, one of the main things that struck me is, I think the image of Serge that I've received from his sort of figure as a sort of like unrelenting moral dissenter, and doing what, Gramsci called, the revolutionary act of discovering the truth together. And then the book is it's a pretty tragic story in a lot of ways. Serge is someone that loses everything 5 times in a row. I mean, he loses his world in France, and then he loses his world in Spain. He loses his world, under the Bolsheviks. And part of it, you talk about his, I think what you call his inner paradigm, the
Right.
kind of like real core of the guy. And I wonder if you could talk through all these transformations that he went through, all the way to practically to the very end. And I know we'll be speculating, but I'm curious if you were to continue to draw the graph where you might see him having gone if he lived longer than he did. But can you talk a little bit about the inner paradigm through all this? What were the things that didn't change?
Right. And this is, and this was, it's funny you said about the losing. And I actually, if I remember correctly, and I'm pretty sure I did, that in trying to explain why he fudged the truth about the Soviet Union, it's because he even talked about it somewhere about, the experience of winning is something new in his life. And that explain that he had lost so much. By 1922, and then after the death of Lenin, 1924, he had already lost so much. He was living on his own from the time he was 12 and a half. And even though that sounds like a crazy story, it's in the police records. The residency records in Brussels show that he was living alone at 12 and a half. So he had lost his family. He left Brussels. He leaves Belgium, and then he loses his original homeland. Then he goes to France, and he loses that, that circle there. So he keeps losing. And so losing really is an important element in his life. And then one brief moment he's on the winning side. After or he thinks he is, although he would later write more honestly about it, like in Conquer City, that by the time he got there, the revolution was exhausted. But that's a different question. But the the through line in his life, and I really, and this is, where he is admirable, is in every instance, he's still looking for a way to ensure that human dignity and freedom is respected. That he finds it in places that we now know were really not the best places for it, but it really was what he was looking for. And when he didn't find it in them, that he moved on to the next idea. Until by the end, he's totally rejected almost everything that he's believed in his earlier life. But he had reasons. He had reasons that I think that he went too far, and became just became a mildly foaming at the mouth anti-communist. But all of it had to do with, respect for the human person. And that's why, what unfortunately people don't know the idea, and this is, I think, why people who've written about Serge have missed it. And it really is the through line that he even talks about towards the end of his life, is that he was very a big admirer of the Catholic inspired philosophy of personalism. And everybody misses it in his autobiography. I missed it 3 times. He actually says, I'm a personalist. He describes himself that way. And personalism is all built around the respect for the human person. And that's what follows him all the way through. So that's when that whatever he might have fudged about his individualist years, in the end, he totally leaves it behind, because the Bernot gang was the reductio ad absurdum of individualism. And the human person is totally discounted. Bolshevism becomes that way. And then he sees that Marxism really he can't find any ethic in it that prevents all the crimes of Stalin to come to rise. And so it's the human person, it's the respect for the human person and for individual freedom that's really the line that follows through his life.
Could you tell us some, and without giving away everything in the book, could you tell us some about sort of where he's intellectually lands in Mexico? I think some of that's
Okay, all right.
yeah.
So this was the period, and again, it's got to do with, finding stuff I didn't expect. And here I have to tip my hat to Robert Caro. and his line, turn every page. Because for the Mexican period, I translated with Richard, uh, the notebooks. And this was a book I really loved. I much preferred it to the memoirs because in Mexico, he's questioning almost all the fundamentals of Marxism, all of them. He's questioning class struggle. He doesn't believe there's the proletariat against the capitalists. He's questioning that. He's saying that that his comrades in the exile community, all of whom are independent Marxists, socialists, they had all abandoned, been in communist parties and abandoned them. He's a huge supporter of POUM, even during its exile period, also in Mexico. And in fact, he's buried amongst POUM members. So he's questioning everything, and he's pissing off everybody. And he talks about problems that he had with his fellow exiles, but in the notebooks, he doesn't go into terrific detail about it. But his letters, which are all preserved at Yale, and there's a lot of them. The guy was a graphomaniac. And I have to say, no, I've never seen anybody type as well as he does. There's never a correction. There's nothing crossed out. Nothing. Every accent is right. It's really amazing. But what we don't see even in the notebooks, which leads me to believe now, because I think you asked me the question when the book came out, did he write it with an eye on publication? And I wasn't sure. Now I think maybe he did, because things have a slightly different flavor in the letters that he sent to people, to his correspondents, mainly in America. That whereas that when he's in Mexico, so he says that people who think that World War II is going to lead to a revolution the way World War I did, are living in like cloud cuckoo land. That ain't happening. That World War II was such a defeat for the working class. It's not happening. The Communist Party has such a hold on the working class, they're not making a revolution. If Stalin doesn't want it, there won't be a revolution. So he recognizes it's not going to be a revolution, and all of the activity of the left have to be changed with that in mind. And he talks in praise of elections and democracy, and he even has nice things to say about social democrats. And because he says they didn't betray, we've been saying forever that the Social Democrats betrayed the revolution. He said you can't betray something you never were part of. They never called for a revolution. And you know what? Looks like they might have been right. So he's moved away from all the revolutionary stuff. So there's that's in Mexico. But he also, even though, and this is, something that I expect people to question and be unhappy about in the book, that's why I asked you about it also, is I'm reading the letters and I'm reading this obscure pamphlet that he wrote called The New Russian Imperialism. And there's nothing you could say about it other than that it's like typical Cold War anti-communism. It's, that if he, that when I discussed this with people when I was writing the book, they said, no, he didn't betray, he never changed. He was a revolutionary socialist, and look what he lived through. Of course he was an anti-communist. Everybody he knew was killed. The Memoirs of a Revolutionary is basically a book-long obituary of like everybody he ever knew. And that's true. However, he's somebody who said the Soviet Union was the greatest menace to the human race. He said that, the Western countries will abandon imperialism. And they have no reason to keep empires. And I know America well enough to know that they don't want to conquer other countries. if anybody else said this, you would say, well, okay, it's 1947. He's typical, you know, uh, anti-communist. But the the fact is, it's anti-communist. I mean, there's and so this for me, and it came up, and this was because I discovered this, not because I went through his letters and letters to him from friends and supporters who worried about him, writing to him saying, you're hanging out with this, you're writing to these terrible people, you're writing for these awful magazines, and think you've just become like another anti-communist. This is what Dwight MacDonald says to him. And Emmanuel Mounier, who was the father of personalism and who became very close to the communists after World War II. He died early, I think 1950 something. And he and Serge had this really heated and ugly exchange where Serge accused the founder of personalism to be a betrayer of personalism because he was a communist. He was so anti-communist that he accused Poom of being Stalinist. And all this stuff was like really upsetting to read, but there was nothing, I couldn't do anything else but say that the guy did become an anti-communist. And, so like the last type of event we did, Jacob, somebody asked, what would he have become? And I remember Donald Nicholson Smith, the great translator, and he said, don't answer that question, Mitch, because we can't possibly know. And I actually pay homage to Donald because I think I way to phrase it in the book is we can't know where he would have gone, but we have to accept where he was. But on the other hand, is Donald here? I don't think so. So I'll say that he could have become like Souvarine, who was his comrade first in the Comintern, and then who ended up supporting the U.S. in Vietnam. Serge never mentions the beginning of the Algerian liberation struggle. He doesn't ever talk about the Viet Minh. So, and that war was already like in place immediately. 1945, the Vietnamese were fighting for their freedom. So that's the stuff that happens in Mexico. So, which leads to the letter to Malraux and the fist fight.
You might want to tell us just where this leads. I think the fist fight is this sort of perfect and tragic uh yeah, you might want to set the scene. I think it tells a lot about what his life was actually like also
Right.
during this period.
So things are going sour in his relations with his fellow exiles, and at so he had this group, and there were Germans, Spaniards, uh, uh, French, all independent leftists, and a lot of them again were like really fed up with Serge's hectoring of them for their support of revolution, but frankly they were delusional. There's like no question about it. Anybody who thinks that after World War II there was going to be revolutionary uprising in uh, in any of these countries, that they were, I should take that back. In Italy, there could have been maybe. In France, the Communist Party was the largest party, but uh, uh, but there was not going to be the same wave that there was after World War One. Anyway, so at a meeting of this group of independent socialists, one of the uh, one of the youngsters in the group, he was in his 30s, Jean Malaquais, whose name would be familiar to literary types because he was Norman Mailer's mentor. He ultimately moved to America. And Malaquais was a Polish Jew. He'd published a very popular book in France, a diary of his time in the army at the beginning of the war. And he accused Serge of being a supporter of the Tories. And Serge is just totally incensed. Who is this, little pisher calling me, uh, a Tory? So when they leave the meeting, Serge, like, starts wagging his finger at Malachi and, how dare you call me that? And he grabs him. He grabs Malachi and it gets physical on the staircase. And Malachi's wife, says, also like accuses Serge. And you say, oh, no. And so Serge calls him a bastard or something, calls Malachi some kind of a bastard. And so Malachi's wife is really upset. And Serge says to the wife, you're lucky you're a woman. Otherwise, I'd smack you too. So, okay, so it's ugly and it's stupid and it's petty. But in an exile community, that's how things are. And it should have just died there with maybe both of them apologizing. Certainly Serge apologizing for the physical whatever. But Serge could never allow anything. Serge was always right, if you asked him. So it ended up as 100 pages of documents on this argument at the International Institute for Social History. 100 pages. And it's not just tiresome, it's like an hallucinatory experience to read it. Because Malachi is laying out his case, Serge is just like a lawyer, point by point, numbering every point. But we find out in Malachi's letter what what his comrades, Serge's comrades, thought of him. And Malachi says, just to let you know, we all call you the Pope behind your back. And we're all sick of you talking about you and Lenin. All of us have been involved in the revolutionary struggle all our lives, so let up a little bit, all right? And so this sets Serge off even more, and there has to be a tribunal to decide the argument, which finds against Serge. They say, just you guys apologize, stop it. Serge refuses it. And he ends up being, cast out from the group. Doesn't look like that ever really happened. But this insane identification with his own ideas is like everything that matters. He wrote for it. He got mad at the people from Poom because he wrote for a newspaper that they edited, and he wanted to appear in every issue. And they said, we don't want this to be the journal of one person or one tendency. We'll publish your stuff, but we have to space it out. And he then wrote to people all over the world saying, I'm being censored. So, by his own comrades. So this is kind of the stuff that like shocked me as I was reading, and I had no expectation to find that stuff. And it depicts it's a perfect portrait of the exile community and of Serge as a person, as seen by others, not by himself.
Well, I want to go back a little bit and then we can start to open it up for questions. Back to sort of his time inside the Soviet Union, directly after the revolution, and talking a little bit about double duty.
Right.
And the way that he saw himself, the role that he saw himself playing at that time. And I want to add to the question, you said that, writing a biography is always as much about the biographer. And just some of your own feelings about this, because I also just opine a little bit. When I was reading it, I think I felt more sympathetic to him during his time when he was there during the revolution, while also being tortured, privately by the realities that he was observing. It made me think it's a little related to the question that Matan is asking in the chat, and I think we should give more time. But I think some of it sort of begged the question of what a revolutionary is. And not only is he sort of like, a revolutionary, he was also alone, a sort of solitary revolutionary is kind of an odd idea, given. I mean, in Gramsci, in the same quote I mentioned earlier from Gramsci about, the revolutionary act of discovering the truth, he says of discovering it together, which was only sometimes sort of what Serge was up to. He was very much on Serge was the main character of his life, certainly.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about the role that Serge saw himself playing when he was inside the Soviet Union writing. And yeah, a little bit about how he saw himself and how you saw what he was doing.
And actually, both your question and Matan's are tied together. And if when you read the book, Matan, you'll see the pseudonym that he used as an anarchist was Le Rétif, and it has many possible translations, and one of them is unruly. So I wanted to get some reference to Le Rétif. And so in the book, I say that he used the pseudonym Le Rétif, which means, somebody who's a rebel, the opponent, somebody who's restive, or the unruly. And I think that as a revolutionary, he was extremely unruly, in the way he upsets the category, just like you said, Jacob. And in fact, to such an extent that this book is appearing in a series from Pluto called Revolutionary Lives. And after I finished it, and they said, "Oh, we're going to publish this in our Revolutionary Lives collection." I said, "I don't know," because I don't know that he was. But your point, though, is a really good one about the revolution of the individual, because that goes back to both his original period as an individualist anarchist, because he didn't believe in mass action. In his individualist period, there was an article that I love to just quote the title of, "The Revolutionary Illusion," because he didn't believe any revolution could succeed in any way. That the Paris Commune was not a great heroic event. It was a waste of lives. Because no revolution ever, he said, makes anything better. And, it's also like a typical anarchist line that it's just going to like put a different ruling class in place. But what he also believed, what the beauty of individualism is, you don't need a revolution, because every individual creates his or her own revolution. And you don't have to wait, because he thought the masses were a bunch of, and he says this in his writings, were nothing but a bunch of like overfed, cowardly drunks. So how could you expect a revolution from a degraded working class? So we who have attained consciousness are all going to make the revolution for ourselves. It's education. And when everybody has reached that level of awareness and consciousness, then the society will change. And so that's why Peter Sedgwick, what was the name? It was the something elitist. Peter Sedgwick, who originally translated the memoirs, and who wrote some really intelligent and insightful and non-hagiographic essays on Serge, called him an elitist. And he was. He absolutely was. Like I said, in the eyes of Victor Serge was never wrong. He couldn't be, because if he believed it, it was right. And if you're an individualist, that's going to be your tendency anyway. I mean, we all believe we're right, or we wouldn't believe the stuff we believe. And so this is why what you just said feeds into what I said before about personalism. I mean, personalism, wants every individual to be the best that they could be as a person by having their dignity respected by everyone around them, and the individual to flourish. And so that's why at the end and at the very end of his life, in his final interview, which was published the day he died, coincidentally, he gave it posthumously, actually, no, just kidding. He gave it shortly before he died, and was published the day he died. He never mentioned socialism. And to go back to double duty, the double duty was protecting the revolution from enemies within and without. So fighting Stalin was one thing, fighting fascism, imperialism, all that was the enemy without. all those who opposed the working class and all that. But that changed also the double duty, because at the end of his life, he's talking about the double duty as protecting Europe and European values. I mean, he even wrote, and I don't hope it's in the book. I haven't read it, so I'll see when it comes out, where he talks about all that's best in Latin America comes from Europe. So, defending the European values was very important to him at the end. And for him, European values were the values of like the French Revolution and the Enlightenment and of human freedom, which was ended up being best protected in the West, which leads us, if I may, to the letter to Malraux. Because at the end of his life, it was published in France and in America, in the New York Times. You could look it up. He wrote a letter to Malraux, André Malraux, saying that had he been in France, he would have supported de Gaulle in 1947. So and this is something that causes great upset amongst many admirers of Serge, or the ones who know about it. And I couldn't find the letter. And then I found it in the New York Times. And then I found another one in a small revolutionary newspaper, magazine that he used to write for. But I absolutely believe, and so he didn't really write it, is usually the line, or if he wrote it, it was just so that he can get a visa so he could return to France. Because he and Malraux knew each other before the war, and they hated each other. They had gotten in a fight before, just as Serge was getting ready to leave France, where Serge threw a cup of coffee on Malraux. Not a way to win friends and influence people. So late in his life, he writes to Malraux saying, and Malraux, you remember, we all know, was a big supporter of de Gaulle. He writes to Malraux, and so the explanation is usually he didn't mean it, he just wanted to get a visa so he can go back to France. But the problem with that is he didn't want to go back to France, or he would have loved to, or America. He really wanted to go to America. But his wife was not leaving Mexico. She had become an anthropologist. She became very well known, a really important and respected anthropologist. She wasn't going anywhere. She loved Mexico, didn't want to leave. So he really did write that letter, is my opinion, and he meant it because his main fear was the communists. And the only person who could defeat the communists in France in the immediate post-war period was de Gaulle. And what happened in 1947 in municipal elections, the communists were defeated like in major cities all by de Gaulle. But again, so the de Gaulle that he supported was both the man who opposed the Nazis, but who was going to defend Western values against the commies. So his double duty changes as it goes along, until in the end, it's still a double duty, but not towards the same thing.
Before we get into some more questions from the audience, I want to ask, I mean, the book, for somebody that is sort of in the pantheon of revolutionaries of the era, I mean, and thus, his presence in the Revolutionary Lives series, I mean, I think the book, in many ways, and we haven't even talked about his wives much yet. The book, I think, really challenges sort of his sainthood, I guess, the sainthood in the canon of these individuals. And I mean, I'm wondering, like, when you described the difference in the image of Serge that you had at the beginning and one at the end. I wonder now, sort of like, what for us, speaking as broadly as possible, engaged in the left, speaking as broadly as possible, intellectually or as organizers, what should we take from Serge, given from your vantage point, having dived into the sort of realities of his life? Like, what should it mean to us?
Well, however, okay, so when you talked about the inner paradigm, I actually talk about it in relation to me and to anybody who writes about him. And I also say that to speak as a phrenologist would say, I don't have the bump for admiration. I just don't have it. So, but I did admire Serge. Matter of fact, I was once interviewed, if there was anybody of the 1,000 people you've translated that you would want to meet, I said, oh, absolutely Victor Serge. But the fact that he was a flawed human being doesn't take detract from him being like a human being. And and I think he's much more interesting as a flawed human being than this, plaster saint that, people genuflect in front of. And I don't think that his fundamental idea is bad at all. That and his tendency and his ability to change. Keynes never said, when the situation changes, I change my opinions. What do you do, sir? He never said that, but he should have. And the fact that Serge was willing to make these changes and to do them with such vigor is an admirable trait. So that's something to take from. And the willingness and the ability to completely overturn your own life. Because you said, Jacob, about the different losing everything. I don't know, that I'm not sure that that's how he would view it, because he was always pursuing what he viewed as the right thing, and to be willing to question that. And that was why I loved the notebooks, because when he's totally, he's standing up against all of his friends, yes, he acts like a 4-year-old in the Malachi incident. It's totally undignified. Totally. At one point, they're accusing each other of like being like Plekhanov. I mean, give me a break. But I can still see. I used to be at stuff at MEP where that kind of stuff would be thrown around as an insult. So his ability to change his ideas with the circumstances, and to question even the beliefs that served as the foundation for all of his activity at a given time. No, he didn't overnight stop being an individualist, but he did question the validity of individualism. You know, communism, he definitely questioned it, like went beyond. But first he questioned it as a way for it to be salvaged, and then when he realized it couldn't be salvaged, he moved on to something else. And that's an enormous change. Whether it's admirable or not to abandon communism, I'll leave everybody to decide. But he did it. And he never mentioned, Marx never doesn't really figure very much in his thinking. He throws out, like I said, class struggle. He just gives up on it. It's not going to happen. So so that's like the positive lesson, that he could be a jackass. Who isn't? There's no reason to think that Victor Serge would not, in circumstances, be a horse's ass, because he's just like everybody else. He was more talented than most. He was a voracious reader. He was able to synthesize all kinds of stuff immediately. Uh, but he was still a human being, and that's a much more interesting person than a saint. I mean, Che was probably the closest there was to a revolutionary saint. But other than that, I can't think of anybody. And so what? And so what?
So we just got another comment. I'll just read it out loud. So this is from Jacqueline Cantwell. It says, "Thank you for this book, Mitch. The left does not need saints, and an understanding of how defeats affects individuals is important. Listening to your description of Serge, I recall a Trotskyist friend who had spent a year in solitary in his youth and suffered severe heart problems and also incited factional fights. He also died embittered and disillusioned. How much did imprisonment and a heart condition affect Serge, do you think?" She says, "I still love Serge. Sometimes you have to recognize that literary types who run in political circles can be a horse's ass." So maybe you could talk a little bit about what imprisonment, and also maybe we could add Orenburg too, in sort of his
Right. Okay.
Gulag experience. What did that do?
Right. So the first thing, and it's really important, and I go into too much, not too much, but a fair amount of detail. He was not in the gulag. He was in an isolator, and we don't know what that means, frankly. I've always thought, oh yeah, the years he spent in the isolator from 1932, what was it, whatever, to 36. When he was released, he's one of the few people who was released thanks to a popular campaign, international campaign. But he wasn't. The isolator meant that he was sent to the Urals, to Orenburg in the Urals, but he wasn't a prisoner. He had to pay his own rent, find his own food, work in order to support himself. And yes, he had to report, I forget what it was, daily, weekly, to the secret police. But his wife was with him at a point. Vladdy was with him. And so he wasn't in the gulag. And he was able to write, and he got letters from overseas. That was cut off after a couple of years. He got books sent to him. One of his closest friends, rather, worked for Grasset, the important French publishing house, sent him books that perhaps he could publish. He was a member of the Writers Union, continued to be a member of the Writers Union. So that wasn't really, an imprisonment. But I will say that his conduct, both when he was questioned and then when was really totally admirable, totally admirable. And what's really amazing is I didn't use the memoir for the source for his interrogation by the secret police. I used the actual transcript, the official NKVD or GPU, whichever one it was at the time, transcript, and it's almost word for word what he remembered. And he lied when he had to, but what are you gonna do under questioning? But he stood up to them. He never wavered. So that was totally admirable thing. But what was the other part of the question there, Jacob? Do you remember?
Talking about sort of like, well, both
Oh, the health.
Jacqueline mentioned his health also. Yeah.
Right, his health, right. And so I don't think the especially the experience of imprisonment, he spent time with when he was isolated. There were people who were Trotskyists there, and he met all these different types, and so to that extent, it influenced him because he was able to write about it. He had the experience of being cut off from everything. For the health wise, his heart was an issue. And so because it was actually being ill that got him to be a novelist. 1928, he was briefly imprisoned. After he got released, he had some kind of terrible stomach problem. He thought he was going to die, and he said, "Okay, now I'm going to be a writer." So there's like a direct connection. And for the most part, he did keep to that. He mainly wrote, although obviously he was still politically involved in the opposition movement. His heart was an issue because Mexico City was perhaps not the best place for him. And he wrote about it in the notebooks about his suffering from the elevation, and it was what killed him when he was 57, which of course now gives me the chance to make my conspiratorialist claim. So he died in the back seat of a cab. He's 57 years old. He's broke, bad marriage, son hates him, daughter he's got nothing to do with, and his shoes have holes, his shoes have holes in the soles, and he dies suddenly in the back of a cab. So interestingly, and he'd always thought the Communist Party, the Mexican Communist Party, was going to kill him. He talks about it constantly in his correspondence. There's a plot with this one just 5 German communists just arrived to kill me. And so he dies in the backseat of the cab. And Susie Weissman told me that when she spoke to Vladdy, he said, that if the autopsy would have shown that he didn't die of a heart attack, I was sure it was Laurette, his wife, who killed him. And The reason that I think there's something to that is that after he died, she joined the Mexican Communist Party. So this was a man, she'd been married to a man for years who had been, thought he was, the target of the Communist Party. The Communist Party had attacked a meeting in which he spoke, in which people got beaten up and arrested. It was really ugly. So, but she joined the Communist Party. And I'm not so certain that, the Soviets played the long game, the GPU or whoever. And I would not doubt for a minute that she was a plant. They had a miserable marriage. Like I said, she was cheating on him with one of his friends. The circumstances of their meeting are very odd, and that a dedicated communist would have given up her, life and like been married to this like old man, this cranky old man, and then 10 years later he's dead. So it's 10 years you dedicated to the cause. Ramon Mercader spent longer than that in jail, and he never gave up, admitted to killing Trotsky or that anybody worked with him. So I might even put it in the book. It's like, why not? But I really think that there's good enough reason to believe that she was a plant. So
Well, Fred asked two questions that are in a slightly different direction. So the first, Fred asked, how does the private biography and doubleness you've discovered affect our reading of the novels and poetry, or does it?
okay, so I don't think that they really affect it at all, either one. The that we're missing an important novel that that he lamented like for the entire final 10 years of his life. It disappeared. Uh, it was confiscated, obviously. It covered his individualist anarchist years. So, because that's the period that's missing. If you look at his novels, they follow his life. They start with from the time he was in prison all the way through. But I don't, that because the novels are all, uh, they all seem like variations on Dostoevsky's The Possessed in a way. Uh, and they are honest novels. Conquered City, like I said, talks about the exhaustion of the revolution, and he talks about anti-Semitism, and so the ugly side is there. And I actually think, Fred, that I don't write much about the novels in the book, I have to say, mainly because Richard did such a great job in all the introductions I'm not going to do better than Richard. So every volume has a great, introduction by Richard that covers the literary stuff really well. But what it does do, and it's an odd way of dealing with the double duty, is what I love the most in Comrade Tulayev is the sympathetic portrait of Stalin, because I think it shows like an amazing uh, ability that Serge had to look at people fairly and squarely. And so Stalin was not just a monster. And he shows Stalin in the book. There's a Stalin with an old comrade from the days of the underground and the confiscations. And Stalin does not come off that terrible in the book until there's a few scenes, and at the end he doesn't come off so good. But so the double duty, I'm not so sure that it applies in the novels. But what I will say about the novels is that I use Richard's introductions also as an excuse not to write about them, because I'm not that big a fan of them. And, Serge was very definitely a French writer, and not always in the best sense. And I think that sometimes the language just gets a little bit too florid and too long. And so he borrows a whole lot from Dos Passos. clearly the main influence, putting real characters in the novel, dealing with the reality. But yes, I don't know if that answers the question, Fred, but it's close as I'm going to get. And you said there was another question, or that
Yeah,
was both?
Fred's second question in a different direction is, did you discover anything new or surprising about Serge's role as a functionary of the Comintern in Germany in the 20s?
Actually, no. That was a really tough period to cover. I have to be honest. And it was one of the reasons that when I was writing the book, I wanted to throw in the towel at that point because I didn't really have anything too terrific about it. His articles, I had all of the articles that he wrote for Comintern publications. And even though, like in the volume that was published, translated, all the translations by Ian Burchell, they talk about how there's Serge's unmistakable style and stuff. They were just like flat, boring uh, propaganda. But in some of this stuff, really, was really interesting. That uh, where he was critical of, without blaming anybody at the Comintern, but blaming the Comintern for the disaster in Germany in 1923 for the failed revolution. So that was something uh, that I was really happy to see and surprised to see, even though he published it in a communist leaning journal. The other thing that Jacob likes Gramsci is that I found out that he knew Gramsci. They were both in Vienna at the same time. And so there's a brief thing about it in my book where Gramsci writing to his sister-in-law, I think, who a lot of his letters from Vienna were sent to, and he talks about the how he went to see a Frenchman and there was somebody who needed some communist Soviet needed uh, an apartment, and how should he go about getting an apartment for this communist, who's also a Jew, when the landlady is an anti-Semite? And Serge gives him advice. The best way to do it is to sell this that this guy is a diplomat or something like that. But he never mentioned Serge, but it was Serge. And I know this because a Gramsci expert who I once met, I asked him, I said, Gramsci and Serge know each other? And he said, oh, absolutely, because in Gramsci's letters, there's a letter where he talks about Serge. And he said, write to me and I'll send it to you. And I wrote to the guy and he was very nice. And his name is Joseph Buttigieg, a name familiar to all the Americans out there because he's Pete's father. So I get to cite and thank Joe Buttigieg in the book. So he knew Gramsci and he knew Lukács, but I really couldn't find anything, and I finally had to tell the publisher, I don't know if I want to continue with the book because I thought that section of the book was not all that good. But I managed to find some stuff, but nothing really spectacular there.
So I want to open up. So again, you can put questions here in the chat. Also, because we have a large group, but not a huge group, if someone unmutes and wants to ask something, I think you should be welcome to do that.
Sure.
I wanted to ask you, I mean, related, going back a little bit to the novels, and I know it makes sense, why you don't spend as much time there, given others' expertise. But I'm curious to your thoughts about why he decided. You said he was in prison, and he's also sick. Why that moment he decides to become a novelist, and what being a novelist meant for Serge in the context of all of his other political writings.
Okay, so this one, you know, the answer I think was the right answer came from one of his comrades. When he was in his early years in Soviet Russia, it wasn't the Soviet Union at the time. In Soviet Russia, he was a member of the French communist group in Russia. And among his comrades was a guy named Marcel Baudy, B-O-D-Y, who wrote a memoir afterwards, in which he talks about this very question. And wait, let me find the quote because it's a really good one, and it gets to the heart of this matter. Hang on one sec. Just put in Bodhi. But it was a matter of, hang on, hang on. It was in the novel that he found a way. I can't find it right now. It was in the, oops. It was in the novel, in writing novels, that he found the way to tell the truth, to tell the truth that he was really feeling. Hang on, let me get, and it was a bad idea to do that. There we go. Um, Hang on. But I've lost everybody now. There we go. He says he's going to dedicate himself to writing because he'd always loved literature. He'd been a translator when he got there, but it's in writing fiction that writing fiction liberated him from propaganda, and he thought that in writing fiction he was able to get to the truth both politically and psychologically and morally by not being bound by the rules of nonfiction and of propaganda. The novel gave him the chance to explore all these things that he hadn't explored before, and it completely opened him up. Now, on the other hand, I just realized as I'm saying this that there was a book that came out a few years ago in France by an anarchist called Victor Serge, The Double Man, where he goes the other way. It's a really vicious book, a really vicious. Every page is just like dripping with venom and hatred of Serge as a lying, duplicitous prick, in which he says that writing propaganda opened the way for him to write fiction because he was already writing fiction. So take your pick. I think they're both really interesting ideas, but I think that if this book, L'Homme Double, was a little bit more measured, there might be something more to it. But I think that he was always a novelist. There was always a novelist in him waiting to get out. That his anarchist writings are really, just really vibrant and exciting, and they're really terrific. And he's a much better writer as an anarchist than he is as a communist. And so it's a kind of like again a return to his roots. But I really think that by writing fiction, it freed him up, and ultimately it freed him because it was because of his novels that he had writers all over the world, not necessarily left-wing ones, who worked to get him freed by by Stalin, and it worked because there was actually two writers, Romain Rolland and Gorky, who were the main people who uh, managed to convince Stalin to release Serge.
You talked earlier about how Serge was a world-class typist and
Right.
also, an almost obsessive writer of letters and notebooks, etc. What were the works that influenced Serge?
Okay. So so there were Russian writers. He loved Platonov. There were various Soviet writers that he wrote because he wrote. I don't know if it's been translated into English, but it's in French. A collection of his writings on culture, and he was like a really sophisticated reader and writer. In fact, one of the biggest surprise, and just to show how omnivorous he was one amongst my books is translations of the poetry of Benjamin Fondan, a name familiar to none of you. And he hadn't been translated into English until a few years ago. And somehow Serge knew his work, and they actually corresponded with each other. So there was nothing, there was nobody, he was, I think I do call him this, he was like the Zelig of the revolutionary left when he was in Paris. He knew everybody. When you go through his address book, there's Antoine. No, 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 I'm sorry. He wrote about Saint-Exupéry. He was friends with Gide. He visited Gide's apartment on the Rue Vanneau. And Gide even sent him criticism of one of his novels. So, and he wasn't like crazy about it, in fact, Gide. But but the writer who I think he most influenced him, and this is very common among French writers, was Dos Passos. The Dos Passos' trilogy. Sartre's, Chemin de la Liberté. That's all Dos Passos in French, and Serge's books are definitely Dos Passos. And not, as I said before, not always in the best way. When because Dos Passos, it places everything in real events, occasionally real people, asides about real people. So putting Stalin in a novel is straight Dos Passos. But what I about his writing style, I'm like a big fan of Peter Handke, the Austrian writer. Not his politics, but his early fiction. The fewer adjectives there are in a book, the better. I don't like the adjectival. And when Richard and I were translating the notebooks, which in many ways were also Serge's way of keeping his hand in while he was traveling. So there's huge sections of the boat trip from France to Mexico. And there are these long passages about his descriptions of the sea, or when he's in Mexico, of the desert. And like I would write to Richard and say, do me a favor. Why can't you translate this? Because why can't this man just take a picture? I mean, I really don't need all this stuff. And and Dos Passos only occasionally falls into that. But I really think, that you don't need to go much further than Dos Passos to get to the heart of Serge as a writer.
Well, we're just about to come up on time.
Oh, really?
And so I wanted to say thanks to everybody first. We had the group come in. I think everybody stayed through the whole thing. So really appreciate everyone's participation. I also just want to say you should really buy this book. I mean, you can tell from Mitch's descriptions. I mean, there's an enormous amount of detail and things we didn't even get into, like his relationships, et cetera, that I think tell another part of the story of this person who's both brilliant and searching and in a constant furor of revolution, both in himself, with his family, and with the other intellectuals at the time. The other thing is that the book is when I said cinematic at the beginning, I really meant that. I mean, it's also a kind of wild journey in almost a Forrest Gump way through so many different parts of the revolutionary era of the century. And yeah, it's an amazing read, and it covers so many other things, including his social world, et cetera. I mean, it's really fun. So Fred has put the link into the comments. Really recommend that you pre-order it. And Mitch, I don't know if there's any last thing that you want to say about the work or the experience of writing it. But yes, I also want to thank you again for the opportunity to get to talk to you about it.
I just want to interject here. I just noticed in the webpage, we promised everyone a 30% discount code. And I don't think I've received that from Lucy. So, Mitch, if you know what that discount code is, you can email it, or we can send it out later to everyone who registers.
Right, all right. I'm surprised to see Lily is not here, actually.
Lily, not Lucy, Lily.
So, but yeah, because she had said that. So, wait, as a teaser for the kind of bizarre stuff not bizarre, this curious things you'll find in the book. It's, my alternate title was Victor Serge Bigamist. So that's something that's very unexpected that you will discover in this book. So, and in fact, Jacob and I were talking about this, and it could be he was a trigamist. We're not sure, but he was definitely a bigamist for 5 years. And to find out how that happens, you'll just have to buy the book. So I want to thank you all for coming. And Fred, thanks for, Jacob, thanks for this. This is great. And, Fred, thanks for the invitation. And, I'll get in touch with Lily. You have the information on everybody who is here?
Yes, yes. Everyone who registered will receive the discount code once I get it from the publisher, from the
Right.
publicist.
Okay, great.
And Mitch and Jacob, thank you very much, both of you. This has really been a interesting, revealing, and surprising in some ways talk for those of us who are fans of Serge in one way or another. I mean, I'm a big admirer of his novels and poetry in particular. And I'm glad to hear that my reading of that does not need to be affected in any way by the
Right.
the new
You're safe.
understanding.
Go in peace, my son. Go in peace.
Okay, thanks again, and appreciate everybody attending and sticking around for the very good discussion.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you
Thanks.
all. This was fun.
Have a good weekend.
Okay, bye-bye.